My name is Mara Voss, I'm 34 years old, and for 5 years I drove 40 minutes each way twice a week to sit in a lake house in Black Mountain, North Carolina, and keep my Aunt Ruth alive on stubbornness and routine. Ruth wasn't my mother. She was my father's older sister, the one who never married, who taught high school biology for 31 years and spent her summers restoring the wood floors of the house her own parents had built in 1962. When my father died, a heart attack in a grocery store parking lot when I was 26, Ruth became the only person on that side of the family who still called me every Sunday. Not because she had to, because she wanted to know how I was doing. So when her hands started shaking too badly to hold a coffee cup, and the doctor said Parkinson's and later something with her heart that needed watching, I didn't think twice. I was a nurse. I knew what caregiving required and I knew what it cost, and I did it anyway because Ruth had never once in my life made me feel like a burden, and I wasn't going to let her feel like one now. My mother Carol and my older brother Wade did not do this. They visited on holidays. They sent cards. Wade lived 2 hours away in Charlotte and worked in commercial real estate, a fact he brought up constantly as though selling office parks gave him some kind of standing on family matters. My mother lived 20 minutes from Ruth and visited perhaps 6 times in 5 years, always for an hour, always managing to mention how tired she was, how her own knees ached, how she just couldn't handle watching Ruth decline the way I apparently could. I want to be clear that I didn't do it for money. I want to be clear about that because of what happened after, because once money enters a story like this, everyone assumes it was the point all along. It wasn't. I changed adult diapers and reordered medications and sat through 2 a.m. hospital admissions and learned to reheat the exact soup Ruth liked without her tasting that it had been frozen, because she was proud and didn't want anyone to know she couldn't cook for herself anymore. I did the parts of loving someone that don't photograph well. Ruth died in March in her own bed in the house she loved, with me holding her hand in a rerun of a nature documentary playing quietly on the TV because she liked the sound of it. She told me for 2 years that she was leaving me the house and her savings. I hadn't wanted to think about it while she was alive. It felt like betting on her death, and I loved her too much for that kind of math. The will named me sole beneficiary. The lake house, paid off, appraised at just under $700,000 in that market. Investment accounts and CDs totaling around $410,000. A car worth maybe $9,000. All told, a little over $1.1 million. My mother did not come to the funeral empty-handed of opinions. She stood at the graveside afterward in a black dress that still had the tags cut off crookedly, and she said low enough that only I could hear, "Well, I suppose you're set for life now." I didn't say anything. I was too tired to say anything. I just watched them lower the only person in my family who had shown up for me, and my mother's first instinct was inventory. Wade was more direct. About 2 weeks later, over a lunch he invited me to that I now understand was a negotiation dressed up as grief support. "You know Mom's going to need help eventually," he said, turning his water glass in slow circles on the table. "She's not getting any younger. And honestly, Mara, it doesn't feel right that you get the house and the accounts and the rest of us get nothing. Ruth was our aunt too. You saw her 6 times in 5 years, Wade. That's not the point. Family is family. Grandma and Grandpa's money should stay in the family, spread around, not just..." He made a vague gesture at me as if I were a hoarding gremlin who had personally engineered Ruth's affection. I want to note here, because it matters later, that Ruth was not my grandmother. She was my aunt. My brother would keep making this mistake, calling her our grandmother, folding her into a vaguer, older, more communal category of family money that somehow belonged to everyone equally regardless of who had actually shown up. I think he did it on purpose. It's easier to feel entitled to an abstraction than to admit you're asking for a cut of what your sister earned by wiping an old woman's chin for 5 years while you sold strip malls. I told him no. Politely, I thought, though he didn't take it that way. I told him Ruth's will was clear, that she'd made her wishes known while she was alive and of sound mind, and that I wasn't going to start subdividing an inheritance based on who felt entitled to it after the fact. He didn't yell. "That's not how my family fights. We do it in a kind of chilled, formal disappointment, the temperature of a hospital waiting room." He said, "That's disappointing to hear," and paid for lunch, which felt like its own small performance, and we didn't speak for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I did something Ruth herself would have approved of, because she'd been the one, oddly, who first put the idea in my head. Late in her illness, on one of her clearer days, she told me a story about her own mother's estate, my great-grandmother's, and how it had torn her side of the family apart for a decade over a farmhouse in Tennessee that nobody could agree how to split. "Don't let money make people ugly around you, Mara," she'd said. "If it's going to happen, put walls up before it happens, not after." So I did. I met with an estate attorney named Priya Anand, a sharp, no-nonsense woman recommended by a coworker whose own parents' divorce had gotten complicated. I told her the whole situation. The will, my mother, my brother, the family money comments. She listened, took notes, and then asked me a question that ended up mattering more than anything else in this story. "Do you have a spare key to the house floating around anywhere? With family, a cleaning service, anyone?" I did, actually. Ruth had given my mother a spare key years ago, back when Ruth could still get around and my mother would occasionally, rarely, stop by to water plants when Ruth traveled. I hadn't thought about that key in years. I told Priya this and she made a note and said, "We're going to want that back or the lock's changed. People do strange things with a spare key and a grudge." I laughed a little when she said it because it sounded almost paranoid. I don't laugh about it anymore. On her advice, I placed the house and the bulk of the investment accounts into an irrevocable trust, with myself as the sole beneficiary and a professional trustee, a small local trust company, administering it alongside me. Priya walked me through what this meant in plain terms. The property was no longer simply mine in the loose, informal sense that a family member could argue their way into. It was legally locked into a structure that made unauthorized transfers, forged deeds, or, "Oh, Mom said I could have it," claims essentially unenforceable without going through the trustee and, ultimately, a court. I also had the locks changed that same week and, almost as an afterthought, something Priya mentioned in passing, I signed up for a free property fraud alert service through the County Register of Deeds, the kind of thing that emails you automatically if any document gets recorded against your property. It took less than an hour total between the phone call to the county and the online sign-up. I didn't think much of it at the time. I did it the way you buy a fire extinguisher. Not because you expect a fire but because the alternative, if you're wrong, is unthinkable. I didn't tell my mother or Wade about any of this. Partly because it wasn't their business. Partly, if I'm honest, because some quiet, tired part of me had already stopped expecting good faith from them and wanted to see what they'd do if they thought the door was still unlocked. For a while nothing happened. My mother and I settled into a strained but workable politeness. She'd call sometimes, ask how work was, mention Wade's kids. Wade and I exchanged maybe 4 text messages in as many months, mostly logistics about Ruth's headstone. I started actually living in the lake house on weekends, fixing the dock, replacing the porch screens, letting myself feel slowly like it was mine. Not just legally but the way a place becomes yours when you've cried in every room of it and are gradually starting to laugh in a few of them too. Then in October, 7 months after Ruth's funeral, I got an email at 6:40 in the morning from the County Register of Deeds Fraud Alert System. Subject line, "Document recorded against your property." I remember exactly where I was. Standing at my kitchen counter in my apartment in Asheville in scrubs, coffee halfway to my mouth, running 15 minutes late for a shift. I opened it on my phone with the specific sinking calm of someone who has spent a career learning to slow her own heart rate down in emergencies. Attached was a scanned quitclaim deed recorded 2 days earlier at the county courthouse, purporting to transfer the lake house from me, from the trust actually, though the document sloppily listed me personally as grantor, to Carol Voss. My mother. The signature on the deed was mine. Except it wasn't. It was a passable forgery, close enough that at a glance, to a clerk processing hundreds of documents a week, it must have looked fine. But I know my own signature, and more than that, I knew exactly where I'd been on the date the deed claimed I'd signed it and had it notarized. At work, at the hospital, on a 12-hour shift with a batch swipe log to prove it. I called Priya before I called anyone else. She'd warned me, half joking, that fraud alert emails sometimes catch nothing more sinister than a utility easement or a neighbor's survey correction. This was not that. She asked me to forward her everything immediately and told me in the same steady voice she'd used the day we set up the trust. "Don't call your mother yet. Don't call your brother. Let me and law enforcement handle the sequence of this. If they know you know, evidence gets harder to preserve." I did what she said, mostly because I didn't trust my own voice not to shake if I heard my mother's. It took 4 days to understand the shape of what had happened, and I'll lay it out plainly because at the time it unfolded in fragments, and only later did I see the whole picture. My mother had gone to a notary, not a random stranger, but a notary public who, it turned out, was a longtime family friend of Wade's. A man named Kurt who ran a small shipping and printing store in Charlotte and had known Wade since high school. My mother had brought a document, told Kurt it was a routine property transfer I'd already agreed to, and asked him to notarize it. Kurt, who had no reason at the time to doubt a woman he'd known for 20 years, stamped it. The old spare key, the one Priya had specifically warned me about, the one I'd forgotten to ask my mother to return in the chaos of Ruth's death, my mother still had. She used it, apparently, to let herself into the house one afternoon while I was at work, not to move in yet, but to walk through with a real estate agent Wade had already lined up, just to get a sense of the property's condition, according to a text message that later surfaced. She'd signed my name on the deed herself. Wade, for his part, had done the research. He was the one who knew from his commercial real estate work exactly which office to record a deed at and how quickly it could be pushed through if he didn't ask too many questions. The plan, as best as Priya and I and eventually the sheriff's investigator pieced it together, was this. Record the fraudulent deed, wait a short window for it to become the official record at the courthouse, and then move quickly before I could react, before anyone could untangle it, to have my mother as the new owner of record. Authorize a locksmith and a moving crew to clear the house of anything of mine and get her moved in. Presented as a fait accompli. Presented probably the way my brother presents most confrontations. Something already decided, arriving at your door in the form of a moving truck rather than a conversation, so that objecting looks less like standing up for yourself and more like making an ugly scene over something that's already settled. I know this because on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the forged deed was recorded, a moving truck did pull into the driveway of the lake house. I know this because I was there. Priya and I, working with a detective from the county sheriff's office named Renata Cole, had decided not to wait passively for the fraud to play out. Detective Cole explained that recorded deed fraud is unfortunately common enough, especially against older or absent homeowners, that the department took it seriously and moved fast once we brought them documentation. My work schedule showing I was on shift during the supposed signing, a notarized statement contradicting the deed's claims, and Priya's trust paperwork showing the property had never been mine to transfer a loan in the first place, forged or not, since transferring trust property required the trustee's involvement. Detective Cole's advice was blunt. Don't confront them privately. Let it happen in daylight with law present, so there's no ambiguity later about who did what. So on that Thursday I sat in my car up the block from the lake house with Priya on speakerphone, and I watched a rental moving truck idle in the driveway of the house I had spent 5 years earning the right to call home, in every sense but the legal one that my mother had just tried to erase. I watched my mother get out of Wade's car in a cardigan I recognized, carrying a box of what I later learned were her own framed photographs, ready to hang them on my walls. I watched Wade direct 2 movers toward the front door with the easy authority of a man overseeing a transaction he believed was already closed. What they didn't expect was the black and white sheriff's cruiser parked discreetly around the curve of the lake road, or Detective Cole stepping out onto the porch. The porch I had rebuilt the screens on myself that summer, with a folder in her hand, or Priya's own car pulling up moments later. I didn't get out of my car right away. I let it happen the way Priya and Detective Cole had planned, because some part of me needed to see, without my presence changing anything, exactly how my mother and brother would behave when they thought no one who mattered was watching. Wade saw the cruiser first and went very still in that particular way people do when a plan is collapsing faster than their nervous system can process. My mother didn't notice right away. She was still fussing with the box of photographs, and by the time she looked up, Detective Cole was already walking down the porch steps toward them, calm, unhurried, the way people who deal in other people's worst days learn to move. I got out of my car then. I walked up the driveway on legs that didn't entirely feel like mine, and I watched my mother's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. Recognition, then confusion, then worst of all, a flicker of irritation as though I were the one being unreasonable by showing up. Mara, she said, this doesn't concern you the way you think it does. We can talk about this like adults. Mrs. Voss, Detective Cole said before I could answer, I'm going to need you and your son to step away from the truck and the property. There's an active investigation into a fraudulent deed recorded against this address on October the 14th. My mother's face went through another sequence then, the irritation curdling fast into something more brittle. Fraudulent, she repeated like the word was unfamiliar to her, though of course it wasn't. It was simply a word she'd never expected to hear applied to something she'd done. I don't know what you're talking about, Wade handled the paperwork. Wade, to his credit or discredit, didn't try that particular sentence. He knew better than to say it out loud with a detective standing on the porch and his mother visibly preparing to hand him the entire weight of what they'd done. He said nothing, which was its own kind of confession. The movers, sensing correctly that their day was not going to end in a paycheck, retreated to their truck without being asked twice. What followed wasn't a screaming match. My family doesn't do those, as I said, and even a forged deed and an attempted eviction couldn't shake us fully out of our particular chilly choreography. There was a lot of my mother saying the word misunderstanding, a lot of Wade suddenly discovering an urgent need to consult our lawyer, a phrase that made Detective Cole's eyebrows lift slightly since, as far as any of us could tell, they didn't have one. Kurt the notary, once contacted separately by investigators, was extremely eager to distance himself from any claim of legal representation and even more eager to cooperate, having realized within about 90 seconds of a phone call from the sheriff's office that he had unknowingly notarized a felony. I did not, in that driveway, get the catharsis some part of me had been hoping for. I didn't get my mother to cry and apologize, or Wade to admit what he'd engineered. What I got instead was a kind of clean, undeniable daylight. The truck backing out of the driveway with nothing in it, my mother's box of photographs still sitting untouched on the porch step where she'd set it down, Detective Cole's calm recitation of what would happen next, that this was now a criminal matter, that the recorded deed would be formally challenged and voided through Priya's office, that my mother and brother should expect to be contacted for formal statements. The 2 days after that were, strangely, the hardest part. Not the confrontation itself, but the quiet after it in an empty lake house with a box of my mother's photographs still sitting on the porch where the movers had left it, because none of us had known what else to do with it. I remember standing on that porch that evening looking at the boxed photographs, pictures I assumed of Wade's kids, of family gatherings I hadn't been invited to or hadn't wanted to attend, and feeling less angry than simply deeply tired, the way you feel after a fever finally breaks and you realize how much of your body's energy the fighting itself had been quietly costing you. I called Priya that night, mostly just to hear a voice that wasn't tangled up in genetics with me. She told me something I've held on to since. You didn't do anything ugly today. You didn't yell, you didn't threaten, you didn't even confront them yourself until it was already handled. You just made sure that when they came for something that wasn't theirs, the truth was already sitting there waiting with paperwork behind it. That's not revenge. That's just refusing to be undefended twice. In the days between the driveway and the first real update from Priya's office, I went back to work because shifts don't pause for family felonies, and there is something strange and almost merciful about spending 12 hours checking 4 lines and charting vitals when your own life has just cracked open. My coworkers knew something was wrong. I wasn't good at hiding it, but I didn't tell most of them the details. I told my closest friend from nursing school, a woman named Denise who had sat with me in the hospital hallway the night Ruth's heart first started acting up years earlier, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, then said, "You know this isn't the first time someone's tried this. You know that, right? This is a whole category of crime. There's a name for it and everything." I hadn't known that, not really, not in any way that had felt true before it happened to me. I'd thought of deed fraud, if I thought of it at all, as something that happened to elderly people living alone, targeted by strangers running some kind of scheme from out of state. It had not occurred to me that the person most likely to forge my name onto a legal document was the person who had, in a manner of speaking, given me that name in the first place. Detective Cole called every couple of weeks with updates, and I came to recognize her voice on my phone the way you recognize weather. Not always good news, but never dishonest news either. She told me at one point that my mother had initially tried to claim during her first interview that I had verbally agreed to sign the house over months earlier and had simply never gotten around to the paperwork, and that she and Wade had merely helped move things along on my behalf. Detective Cole said this with the flat, professional patience of someone who has heard 100 versions of the same unconvincing story, and asked me, almost as a formality, whether there was any truth to it. I told her the truth, which was that my mother and I had never discussed the house at all except for that one comment at the graveside about being set for life, and that I had certainly never authorized anyone to sign anything on my behalf, verbally or otherwise. Detective Cole said that matched what they were finding elsewhere. My badge swipe records from the hospital, time-stamped and unambiguous, placing me on shift, under fluorescent lights, charting a patient's oxygen levels at the exact hour the deed claimed I'd been in a notary's office in Charlotte signing my name away. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from having to prove, with documentation, that you didn't do something you never would have done. I found myself in that stretch of weeks gathering old text messages, old call logs, anything that might corroborate the shape of my relationship with my mother and brother. Not because Priya asked me to build a character case exactly, but because I think some wounded part of me needed to see it laid out chronologically, in black and white, the years of small absences and late arrivals and comments about being set for life, so that I could stop wondering even briefly whether I was somehow the unreasonable one in this story. I wasn't. The record made that plain in a way that arguing with my mother over the phone never could have. The legal aftermath took closer to 5 months to fully resolve, and it was frankly less dramatic than the driveway, mostly paperwork, mostly waiting. The recorded deed was voided by court order within a few weeks, restoring clear title to the trust. That part, Priya told me, was almost mechanical once fraud was documented. The criminal side moved slower. Kurt the notary avoided serious charges by cooperating fully and testifying that my mother had represented the document to him as routine and already agreed upon by me, which was itself a form of fraud against him, using his trust in a family friend's honesty to launder a forged signature into something official-looking. My mother was charged with felony forgery and attempted theft by deception. Given her age, her lack of any prior record, and, I'll admit, a psychological evaluation that the prosecutor's office ordered and that came back describing a woman who seemed to genuinely, almost delusionally, believe she was entitled to what she tried to take, the district attorney offered her a deferred prosecution agreement rather than pursuing trial, restitution covering my legal costs, a period of probation, mandatory counseling, and a formal no-contact provision regarding the property itself, meaning she was barred from returning to it or attempting any further transfer for the duration of the agreement. If she completed it without incident, the felony charge would eventually be dismissed. If she didn't, it would proceed to full prosecution. Wade's situation was murkier and in some ways harder for me to watch resolve. He hadn't signed anything himself. He'd researched the recording process, arranged the moving truck, and lined up the real estate agent, but the actual forged signature and the misuse of the notary had been my mother's doing, and prosecutors, working with limited resources and a cooperative primary defendant, ultimately declined to charge him criminally, treating his involvement as aiding an offense they'd already resolved through his mother's plea. It wasn't justice exactly. It was the particular, unsatisfying shape that consequences often take when the person who did the least damning individual act also happens to have the cleanest paper trail. But I'd stopped by then, expecting the world to hand me a tidy ending. Priya's office did pursue a separate civil claim against him for the costs directly tied to his role: the moving truck, the real estate agent's fee, a portion of the legal expenses, and he settled it grudgingly rather than risk a deposition. I gave a formal witness statement during the investigation, which was, oddly, one of the more difficult parts of the whole ordeal. Not because it was hard to tell the truth, but because saying it all out loud in an interview room to someone taking careful notes made it undeniably, permanently real in a way that even the driveway hadn't. Sitting across from a soft-spoken investigator describing 5 years of caregiving followed by a forged signature with my own name on it, I understood something I hadn't let myself fully feel yet: that this wasn't really about the house or even the money. It was about being told, in the most concrete language possible, a felony charge, a court order, that what I'd given Ruth and what Ruth had given me in return had been real and mattered, and could not simply be signed over by someone who'd shown up for 6 holidays in 5 years and decided that counted as equal claim. I haven't spoken to my mother since the driveway. She's tried to call twice, both times leaving voicemails that started with, "I know you're upset, but," and I haven't finished listening to either one. I'm not interested right now in whatever comes after that, but maybe someday I will be. Grief and anger don't always move in straight lines, and I've learned not to promise myself permanent positions on things that 7 months from now might look different. But for now, the no-contact provision on the property isn't really doing much work that I haven't already done myself. Wade texted me once, weeks after the settlement, a message that read in full, "For what it's worth, I don't think it should have gone this far." I looked at that message for a long time. I thought about all the ways it managed to acknowledge nothing. Not the forgery, not the moving truck, not his own research into recording deeds, not even a clear admission that, This far had been his and our mother's doing rather than some abstract weather system that had simply happened to the family. I didn't respond. Some silences are their own complete sentence. I think too about Ruth's own advice, the way I keep circling back to it, walls before, not after, and about how easy it would have been to hear that advice and do nothing with it, the way most well-meant warnings get filed away and forgotten under the assumption that surely your own family wouldn't. I understand why people make that assumption. It's a kinder way to live most of the time, and I don't think less of anyone who extends that kind of trust to the people who share their blood. I extended it too for years in every way except the one that turned out to matter. I just happened to also, almost as an afterthought, spend an hour on paperwork that meant the trust one extended everywhere else didn't have to be the only thing standing between me and losing everything Ruth had worked her whole life to leave behind. I still live in the lake house most weekends. I finished the porch screens. I planted the tomatoes Ruth always meant to get around to and never did, in the spot behind the kitchen window where she used to say the morning light would be perfect for them, if only her knees would let her dig. They came in well this year. More than I could eat alone, so I've started leaving baskets of them at the end of the driveway with a hand-lettered sign, the way Ruth used to. People sometimes ask me when I tell an abbreviated, sanded-down version of this story, whether I regret setting up the trust in the first place. Whether locking things down so early before anyone had done anything wrong was itself a kind of unkindness, a vote of no confidence in my own family. I understand the question. For a while I asked it of myself too in the months after Ruth died and before the forged deed surfaced, when my mother and I were still exchanging careful, ordinary phone calls, and I sometimes wondered if I'd overreacted, if the trust and the locks and the fraud alert had been paranoia dressed up as prudence. I don't wonder that anymore. What I've come to believe and what I'd say to anyone standing where I stood 7 months before that driveway, inheriting something real, something earned through years nobody else showed up for, and unsure whether protecting it made you cautious or cold, is this peace that has to be paid for over and over in silence and accommodation, and pretending not to notice what people are capable of was never actually peace. It was rent. And the moment you stop paying rent on a peace that was never real to begin with, the people who'd been quietly living off it will very often show you, with startling speed, exactly what they'd been planning to do the whole time you kept the lights on for them. I didn't build walls because I expected my mother and brother to become the people who tried to steal a dead woman's house out from under the person who'd actually loved her through the end of her life. I built the walls because Ruth, in one of her last clear afternoons, told me that money makes people ugly if you let it, and that the only real defense against ugliness arriving later is deciding, quietly in advance, not to leave the door unlocked for it. I didn't know when I sat in Priya's office signing trust paperwork on an ordinary Tuesday, that I was preparing for anything specific. I just knew Ruth had been right about almost everything else in her life, and I wasn't going to bet against her on this one either. The tomatoes are good this year. The porch holds. And some mornings, sitting out there with coffee and the lake going pale gold at sunrise, I think about the box of photographs still sitting, for all I know, wherever my mother eventually took it. Pictures of a family that, for one Thursday morning, tried to walk back into a house it hadn't earned, and found the door not just locked but already patiently, legally, permanently closed.